We are going to be hosting it next year as well. Please stay tuned for more information. But we're very excited to present a series of speakers, our fellows that will be talking about their own research and presenting them each week through December. So without any more wait, let me introduce our speaker for today. Claire Nguyen is a junior studying history with minors in Asian American Studies and English. A proud daughter of Vietnamese refugees, she immerses herself in several Southeast Asian American spaces, previously serving as curriculum co-coordinator for UC Berkeley's Southeast Asian Student Coalition 2020 Summer Institute, and as the president of the Penn Vietnamese Students Association. She's currently a college organizer for Vietlead's Community Defense Youth Team, and on campus, she's greatly involved with Patch and ASAM, and she is an APALI facilitator, a peer mentor, and co-chair of the ASAM Undergraduate Advisory Board. And this list is lying, an ASAM Fellow. So it's my delight to welcome Claire. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Let me just share screen quickly. Okay, hold on one second. All right, can everyone see this okay? Yes, beautiful. Yes, thank you, Dr. Khan. Wait, sorry, do you hear that in the back? Do you hear like a rustling? I will go ahead and, no? Oh, okay, sorry, that's my heater that just turned on. But thank you again, Dr. Khan, for that introduction. My name is Claire, as she introduced, and I'm gonna be talking about my project, No Mercy, Asian Americans in the American Carceral State. And before we begin, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. I am calling from the city of Philadelphia, just off Penn's campus, where our campus is. Being on this land, we acknowledge that we have the privilege of learning and living on unceded Lenni Lenape land. May we recognize the painful history of exclusion and erasure of Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land we are gathered. May this acknowledgement signify our commitment to understanding the settler colonial legacy of the institutions we are part of today. And because I know people are all over the country or the world even, there is this really great tool, this website that I'm going to drop in the link, where you can actually identify whose land you're on currently. And yeah, to get us started, I just wanted to define the carceral state. And so the carceral state is this idea and this understanding that there is a carceral system that is very deeply internalized and institutionalized in the US specifically for the context of this talk. And it includes the formal institutions of policing, incarceration, detention, and deportation. And I think this quote from Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish really embodies this idea of the carceral state, in that it's almost surprising when we start to think critically about the existence of institutions like factories, schools, and hospitals, which all end up resembling prisons and how they all mirror each other. And Michel Foucault writes about this extensively in his book, which is sort of how carceral studies develops, and this idea of like the carceral state being deeply, deeply, deeply institutionalized. This idea of the carceral has informed contemporary scholarship on prisons, detention, and deportation. And for this talk, I am going to state that the carceral state is embodied by what we call crimmigration, which would most apply to Asian American and Pacific Islander communities whose mass migration to the United States is relatively recent, and we remain a predominantly migrant community. So to go a little bit more into what crimmigration is the legal system at which migrant communities are entangled at the intersection of criminal justice and immigration systems in the US. And this is informed by the fact that the rise of mass incarceration in the United States intersected and overlapped with the increasing criminalization of migration and migrants through the 1980s through today specifically, though one could argue that migration has continually been criminalized in the United States. And some laws that really inform this more contemporary criminalization of migration fall under Reagan and Clinton's war on drugs, war on crime, war on poverty. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act sort of created the distinction between crack and powder cocaine and led to the heightened criminalization of primarily Black men for drug-related offenses in over-policed, low-income Black neighborhoods. The 1994 crime bill enforced mandatory sentencing and is attributed to have spurring mass incarceration as we know it. And I bring this up because it's actually authored by the current Democratic presidential candidate, one we might see as one who would be more welcoming of migrants, though we understand that he has this history of contributing to the policing and violence against migrants. The 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act is really what caused this heightened criminalization of migrants. It allows for felons to be automatically deported, and it limited the authority of immigration judges who previously could consider the conditions of the migrant before ordering deportation. So currently, immigration judges don't really have a say in whether or not someone can be deported. They're mandated to enforce the law. Lastly, it also said that this is often left out, that migrants who could not be deported because their home countries could not accept them would remain locked up indefinitely. So this law really outlines what we envision when we think of immigrant detention and immigrant deportation. And the last law that's also left out of this is also left out of the narrative of mass incarceration and also the rise of the criminalization of migration is the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which ended welfare as we know it. It was used as an assault on poor Black and Brown communities. And though this is not very well known, Southeast Asians in the US were the largest ethnic group at the time receiving public support in the country as a new refugee community. And so this law specifically really impacted these new Southeast Asian refugee communities and sort of continued to place them into poverty, into places without support. In 2003, ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, was created within the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after the September 11th attacks. And what's significant about this is that immigration went from being part of the Immigration and Nationality Services under INS in the Department of Justice to ICE in the Department of Homeland Security. So here from this transition of immigration being housed in INS to ICE, immigration explicitly is now viewed as a security threat, an issue of national security rather than an issue of potentially civil rights and naturalization. And lastly, I wanted to go over Trump's 2017 executive orders, which increased border security, mandated for, I think, 10,000 new ICE employees to be added to the force, created a mandate to build the wall, the Muslim ban, and also threatened to withdraw funding from cities that remained sanctuary cities and who would not cooperate with ICE. So one of his executive orders actually stated that if you did not cooperate with ICE, you would be withheld federal funding. And so this sort of pressured a lot of cities to begin cooperating with ICE, allowing their local law enforcement to serve as immigration officers and to actually detain migrants had they been arrested for something unrelated to immigration at all. And the next thing I wanted to go over is, what do we know about AAPIs in the American carceral state and what don't we know? So there is extensive literature on Chinese exclusion and the Angel Island Detention Center. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first immigration law in the United States that criminalized migration and targeted a specific ethnic group or a place of origin. Angel Island is often talked about as the Ellis Islands of the West, but it really was the first immigrant detention center. Here, illegally present migrants could be held. Many underwent sexist, classist, and ableist examinations before ultimately being deported. There's also extensive literature on Japanese American incarceration during World War II, when FDR's Executive Order 9066 allowed the detention of Japanese non-citizen immigrants and their American-born descendants during World War II, justified by this concept of military necessity against the potential threat of spies in the US for the Axis powers. And what's significant about this is that unlike enemy, alien, Italian, and German migrants, Japanese and Japanese Americans were denied due process before they were incarcerated. There was actually a formal process for these Italian, German, European white migrants to have due process before being incarcerated. Japanese and Japanese American citizens were not given this process at all. Then lastly, following the September 11th attacks, the Islamophobia that infected the US, the world, led to the creation of ICE, the detention of West and South Asian Muslim migrants. And this anti-Muslim hysteria has continued through today with Trump's legislation as recent as 2017. And so while we have all of this information and this understanding that Asian Americans have actually, or Asians and Asian Americans have sort of been people greatly impacted by the carceral state, we actually don't know that much about people who are in the carceral state or impacted by it currently. And this is because prisoner data in the US is not disaggregated. So in 2018, the other prisoner population, other being a marker of race, was 12%. And this includes anyone who is not Black, who is not white, and who is not Latinx, and this includes AAPI persons. However, independent reports show that the AAPI prisoner population grew by 250% between 1990 and 2000, which would be indicative of the rise in mass incarceration and something that we shouldn't really be surprised with, given the heightened criminalization of communities in several capacities, specifically low-income communities. And I'm not sure if this is a completely updated statistic, but according to a 2018 report, 17,000 Southeast Asian Americans have deportation orders, and we've seen an increase of the deportation of Asian migrants, specifically former refugees from Southeast Asia, since the beginning of the Trump administration. And so my research question really broadly is, what are the experiences of contemporary Asian Americans with and within the carceral state from the 1980s to the present? And this is a really large question because there lacks any scholarship. There are a few legal reports. I've looked through the internet and every resource I can, and there isn't that much information. And I attribute this to the fact that prisoner data is not disaggregated. There isn't a category for like Asians in prisoner data. And so because of this, there is sort of this difficulty to access that information about people in the Asian American community who are being impacted by the state. I also attribute this to the Asian American attachment to the model minority myth and the lack of knowledge and community about AAPIs impacted by the carceral state. The lack of understanding of the fact that there are low-income Asian Americans who are impacted by the state. And these people live in over-policed neighborhoods and are also impacted by the state in a similar manner to their Black and brown siblings. And the questions that I wanted to answer with my project, specifically this project, were why are Asian American organizers mobilizing their communities against these systems? And what is the role of inter-ethnic solidarity and coalition building in community organizing against crimmigration? And with the second question, I want to demonstrate that perhaps the experiences of individuals impacted by the American carceral state are shared across ethnic and racial lines, even if dominant narratives about our communities render that we are not impacted by these systems in the same way. And further, there isn't that data that shows us within the prison system. We are invisible in the system because we are just others, along with the other ethnicities that do not fall under these broader racial categories. And so to accomplish this, I wanted to pursue an oral history project, learning from the organizers who are on the ground, who have been doing this work and who have built this body of knowledge over the past 20 plus years of organizing to free Asian Americans specifically from prison, but also their Black and brown siblings. And so I conducted semi-structured interviews with AAPI organizers, and I journaled and reflected following the interviews to sort of center also my own interpretations and understandings following the interview. And I recognize my position as an undergraduate at Penn and also a college organizer for a team that does anti-deportation work. And so my work, my work is beyond sort of academia. My work is on the ground as well, and I wanted to recognize that. And also having an impacted person in my own family, my research is informed by my experiences with my family as well, and the experiences that I very much have lived through in addition to these organizers, and trying to embed my own experiences into the research as well. And so to jump in to some of the material I collected, I interviewed a 4th generation Japanese American individual who is a local organizer with Philadelphia, the Japanese American organization that has campaigns to end immigrant detention and incarceration. And he views his work and himself as what he calls a voice of reason in the room when people are talking about these things as if they've happened and it's done. When we know that from the Japanese American standpoint, 75 years after World War II, our elders are still traumatized by it. And he talked a lot about how his own journey in understanding his identity as a Japanese American, as an Asian American, being a mixed race person, was informed by his increasing exposure to Asian American communities and other migrant communities who were facing these experiences of state-sanctioned violence. He says that he saw more of his experience, both as an individual and as a Japanese American, in the lives of other migrant communities. And he was really moved and politicized by this understanding that he saw himself in these communities. And he was also particularly politicized by the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement as we know it in 2014, to really organize around incarceration and detention, knowing well the impact that it's had on his own family decades after their own displacement. And so one of the actions that he discussed, which he organized, was a vigil outside of Burke's Family Detention Center outside of Philadelphia over the summer. And his organization wanted to center Haitian immigrant rights groups, as 4 of the 5 families at the time in the center were Haitian. And something he described was that they brought their Haitian drums. He and his organization brought their Japanese taiko drums, and they both used conch shells for different reasons. And part of the vigil was singing and creating music and making noise outside of the detention center. And I was really interested in how he drew these lines between the similarity of the instruments they use, but also like the differences and like how they would like employ them in order to create music and this sense of joy, within their community organizing. And he said it was one of the most transformative solidarity building exercises that he's had, being there at the detention center and feeling that sense of joy across ethnic, racial lines, across experiences. And he described how happy you could actually see the families who were detained in the center from where they were protesting, and the joy that they had to hear their own language being sung and spoken to them was something that really moved him and made him see the power of solidarity and coalition building. But something he also emphasized was the sense of apprehension and the sense of devastation. He describes that it sort of gutted him to be there and then need to leave and to be back in his home, but to also like leave behind these individuals who had no idea if and when their detention was going to end, something that he drew a connection to for Japanese Americans who had no idea when they would be freed, how long they would be in these camps. And he ultimately concluded our conversation saying that it's a scary time to be doing this work. And in my debrief, I remember reflecting on how anxious I felt after the conversation, after hearing that from him. And he expressed incredible concern for organizers and activists under the current administration, who has been increasingly violent towards protesters and resistors. And I think this is most notable in the news recently, with protesters in Portland, Oregon over the summer during the Black Uprising and the arrest of protesters. This past Wednesday, Anthony Smith, who is an outspoken Philadelphia activist, was arrested for his Black Lives Matter activism. He's being currently held on multiple federal charges, which his organizations say are bogus. So we have this increasing assault on protesters. And I just remember, hearing this from this conversation and sort of like considering, well, would I ever be in that position? Would I ever have to experience something like that? As long as I continue the work that I've been doing? And so I did. I found myself in that position on October 9th, 2020, which was at the beginning of this month. The Free Nancy campaign, which I showed up for, was in response to the executive director of Vietlead, Nancy Nguyễn, being arrested on charges of littering and trespassing onto the property of the newly appointed ICE director's home. And so she was arrested for protesting during a day of action that was going against the new ICE director, Tony Pham, who himself was a Vietnamese refugee. And that day of action was across the country and spoke against ICE's human rights violations, given the recent news of the hysterectomies in a detention facility in Georgia, and also just against sort of his complicity as a Vietnamese refugee, as a migrant himself, in enacting this violence against migrants. Oops, sorry. But Nancy was eventually freed after being detained for 21 hours. But from this day, and from my experience on the ground from this day, this could not have happened without a coordinated national effort to free her by putting pressure on the Philadelphia Police Department and the City Council as well. And it was a collective effort grounded by this ethic and this sense of community care. And without it, Nancy says that she probably would not have been freed so quickly, even though 21 hours in detention is a really long time for littering charges. She was also arrested for something she did in Virginia. So this was an out-of-state arrest. And so what I want to emphasize here is that the success of this action, specifically to free her after her arrest, is attributed to this idea of coalition building and solidarity. And to explain that a little bit more, I just wanted to not necessarily walk through the entire day, but just highlight for y'all some moments that I really felt this in very mundane things like these dumplings. So we first arrived outside of the roundhouse where she was being held around noon. At the time, Vietlead didn't really know where she was. We were trying to figure that out, but also we were mostly waiting. And a lot of the folks had been doing jail support since the night before, and people were really tired and hungry. And we eventually found out that she had a hearing for her arraignment around 4 p.m. and would be released accordingly. So we decided to disperse and to go get lunch and to rest at an office nearby that someone volunteered. And so luckily my friend from school was also at the protest with me, and we decided to get xiaolong bao from Chinatown. The roundhouse is just near Chinatown, and I had not yet been to Chinatown since coming back to Philadelphia because of the pandemic. And we came back with a xiaolong bao, and another Vietlead staff had a giant tub of chow mein and wanted to share it with folks, but we didn't have plates and utensils. So what my friend and I did, we started cutting up the styrofoam containers for our dumplings so that people could have makeshift plates. And we found sort of utensils gathered here and there. And again, while this is such a small act, in this moment of uncertainty, of unrest, we found ourselves sitting around a table, laughing, smiling, watching funny videos, and just again this sense of joy in this collective effort to care for one another amidst the turmoil of trying to free a community leader. Throughout the day, I remember just feeling panicked, but knowing that I needed to tell as many people as possible that this was happening in order to continue to put the pressure on Philadelphia's police department in order to free Nancy. And so I remember posting on every single social media page I had. I remember posting on every single Facebook group I had, which is a lot given that I'm a college student in the era of COVID-19 when everything's online. I remember sending texts to my cousins who I had not talked to for a while. I remember just emailing professors, even just saying, hey, this is happening. Would you be able to call, or could you share this with your classes if possible at all? And as we were walking back to the roundhouse after this rest to sort of welcome back Nancy and to continue our protest, people literally gathered with us as we were walking back. And at its peak, there were probably 40 to 50 people outside the roundhouse waiting for Nancy to be free. And It wasn't just Vietlead and Asian American organizations that were there. Latinx organizations, people from all over the place were gathering to support Vietlead in trying to free Nancy. At a point of time, the youth of Juntos, which is a community organization in Philly, were leading chants in Spanish even, and we were just chanting outside waiting for her to be released. And this was one of the songs that we started chanting. And at first it was really awkward. You know, people were tired, people were hungry, people didn't know what was going on. And, you know, we would start singing it and then it would slowly drop off. Some people would sing, others wouldn't. And it was really disjointed. And through all the chanting, people were getting more and more exhausted. Vietlead staff were handing out cases of water and snacks for everyone who showed up for the protest. Cars were driving by honking. And it was this sense of like, it was the sense of apprehension, but also joy. We knew that Nancy was most likely to be released. So we were just waiting for her to come. And as the tension built up, waiting for her ultimate release, we grew more and more tired with the chants. For about 30 minutes, we're just standing there. And ultimately, when she was released around 5 p.m., met by immediate cheering and clapping on the most beautiful day, we started singing the song again. And this time it wasn't awkward, it wasn't disjointed, it was in unison. We knew the words by this point, and we kept singing it over and over again. And recalling that memory, and also during that point, I was crying because I was just so moved by this communal sense of music and joy to see this freedom fighter be freed. And, you know, I think from my research and from my findings, what I've realized is that it's about showing up, and it's about this sense of communal care and solidarity and coalition building in order to have this mass mobilization of people to resist the carceral state. If we understand that the carceral state is so embedded in our society that people who speak out against it are at the threat of it, we must show up in the masses to demand that this is not right. And quite frankly, the research that I was pursuing can never be complete as long as the carceral state exists, as long as migrants are incarcerated for their status, and as long as communities of color specifically are under assault by the carceral state, and even people who dare speak against it. And I think, you know, and I was just also moved by this aspect of music and joy in resistance, from the drumming and the conch sounds outside of Burke's Detention Center and the jumping up and down of the Haitian families who are detained there, to, you know, the joy of seeing a community leader be free, and the joy of people remembering the words without awkward pauses and breaks. I think there's something there to be said about the importance of just showing up and the importance of this aspect of community. And yeah, that's all I have for y'all. Thank you so much. This concludes the formal aspect of my presentation. And yeah, I will be happy to take any questions.
Claire, thank you so much for your impassioned scholarship and sharing with us your research and also your own activism in a profound and very personal way. So a great appreciation for you and your work. And Claire will take questions. So if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or perhaps you just have a comment or would like more information. I think Claire would be happy to share any of that.
Yes, Dr. Park.
Well, I'll just start. I mean, that was just wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. And, you know, it was really useful to have those dates put up. You know, I was thinking, you know, so when we teach, my history kind of runs out in the 1980s. And so it's really important, I think, to have that. And also you know, just what happened in the Clinton years. It's so important to be aware of as we're struggling now. But I just wondered, your sense, you know, the really important prison abolition movement right now. And, you know, that's like it's amazing that that phrase even exists in the mainstream, right? And it's one of those pie in the sky things that, you know, is like we have to work toward. I don't know how much research you've done into that aspect, but I wonder if there's any mention of what you're dubbing crimigration in that movement in particular. And is there a way to combine that, you know, that kind of radical opportunity? And then just like a comment, which this is just so obvious, but there's just such a clear continuation of just decimating families in these policies. I'll just state the obvious, you know, from like exclusion to these bachelor societies to these hysterectomy. I mean, it's just totally unbelievable, you know, so just, yeah, just the kind of family annihilation, child separate, you know, obvious, it's just pointless even to say, but just to underscore that. Yeah, any comments you have?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people tend to think of prison abolition as a movement that is separate from this idea of crimmigration and like how people are also entangled in immigration. But I think for a lot of migrant organizing groups specifically, like we view ICE detention centers as prisons. Like we view them as prison camps. And it's almost as if, you know, a migrant status is another way for people to be incarcerated. And so I feel like they do go hand in hand in the sense that a lot of we employ specifically an abolitionist framework. Like we want to see the end of detention centers and the end of ICE as an agency because of the gross human rights violations it has enacted upon families since 2003. I think for a lot of the Southeast Asian anti-deportation radical movement, they have seen this begin and continue from the 1990s to the present, and they see how it's evolved and become worse and worse with ICE, and then since Trump's election as well. And so understanding how a lot of these things have been created in their lifetimes, they want to see them go also in their lifetimes, knowing that a lot of these struggles are intertwined. Also, a lot of prisons actually rent out space to ICE. So, you know, you have facilities where it is a prison, but it also is an ICE detention center. There are local law and there are contracts that local police departments have where they can, if they arrest someone, for example, like a broken light or something on their car, and they see that they're an undocumented person, they can take them in right there and transfer them over to ICE. There's a process called ICE transfers where prisoners who are migrants with criminal records under current laws can be immediately transferred to ICE and detained again. So you have people who are serving their sentences fully, but then are transferred over to ICE and just ultimately held in prison again. So I think in that sense, we view, you know, detention and ICE as like an extension of policing and prisons. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question. Hi, Angela.
I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to say I really loved this presentation. You gave just like a lot of good background info, and I especially found the part about the music and that sense of camaraderie to be really powerful. And like it isn't something that I feel like people like talk about much, you know, when talking about protests and stuff, which is why I really valued that part and really enjoyed listening to it.
Yeah, I actually was trying to look into the history of the song that we sang for Nancy's campaign because like during then someone was like, oh, Nancy taught this to us, let's do this one. And so I was looking it up, and I think it came from the labor movement in the 30s and has actually gained a lot of popularity recently from Black Lives Matter protesters. So a lot of folks will sing, Malcolm X was a freedom fighter, he taught us how to fight. People will sing, Assata Shakur was a freedom fighter, she taught us how to fight, as a way to invoke these people and to bring them in this space. I was also interested that it actually came from a hymn, so like a religious hymn. So that could be like another point of like additional research, which I think is really interesting and fascinating and makes narrowing my interest more difficult, but is really interesting. Yeah.
Actually, could I just add, there's actually a lot of scholarship around in folklore around these resistance songs. And, you know, several of them actually go back to the period of slavery, when slaves would sing these songs that were actually, you know, protest songs as they worked. So there's a whole body of literature too, but you need to actually just focus on this. But at another time, we can talk about that. Other thoughts or questions?
Claire, thank you for sharing your research, and then also for sharing your experience of showing up to an action, right? Because I think for many of us, like, that is something that, especially for Asian American and Asian individuals, like, that's not something, Asians don't protest. That's not what you do. You're supposed to be model minorities. And so in sharing that, I was really struck about the way that you really noted the value of the mundane, right? As you were saying, like the songs, the drumming together, and like the eating together. And I think that's an invaluable way to start thinking about the way that solidarity emerges, right? Because, you know, it's hard, right, to work beyond your community, even within your community. And I wonder if you could like speak a little bit more about those moments of the mundane, and what are the possibilities there?
Yeah, I think I think sorry, processing your question. Yeah, I think, you know, with what you said about, you know, the mundane being the site of like solidarity building, I think too, when we think of how like the carceral system is fueled by this idea of racial capitalism, and how capitalism is so internalized that we, you know, guilt ourselves when we rest, or when we are not productive in like our everyday actions. And so, you know, these moments of rest, and just like eating together and nourishing ourselves, I feel as like an organizer, but also like in analyzing my experience as like a piece of like data and scholarship, is that this is like a way to resist, you know, pushing yourself to be out on the street for hours to protest something, but not taking that moment of resistance to resist that desire to push yourself in that capacity as well, if that makes any sense. I remember when I found out about Nancy's arrest, it was like a minute before I was supposed to meet with Nancy and our team. And I remember thinking like, I don't know how long I'm gonna be out there. So I packed like a whole bag of cuties, like tangerines, and like 2 water bottles, and was like, I'm gonna be out there for so long. And then when I got there, my friend who was there was like, Claire, did you eat breakfast yet? Like, I have buns that I bought. And I was like, why did I like pack food? Of course there was gonna be food here, because I think the organizers at Vietlead specifically understand that like care is crucial to the organizing work they do. If you're not sustaining yourself, how can you expect to sustain others as well, and to build towards something? And so yeah, I also view like eating the dumplings. I was like, I'm gonna splurge and get these overpriced dumplings, because, you know, today's emotionally taxing, but also like they're delicious and I want to enjoy them with my friends. And like that in itself is an act of resistance. So yeah, thank you for asking that question.
So Claire, I know that, you know, months ago when your fellowship started and you began to think about this project, it looked very different in June than it does in October. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, the shifting of this project and how it's changed. But then the second question I have too is, in this process of doing this work, right? And you'd mentioned that in the organizing, there is a lot of care, right? And so the second part of my question is, you know, given this particularly critical moment in our lives where it's sort of fraught with lots of tension and lots of competing moments of pain, like how are you, Claire, and Nguyen, doing self-care?
Thank you,
Particularly
Dr.
after all the shifts.
Thank you for your question. Yes, my projects looked very different in February when I was applying for the fellowship. I think other folks who are doing the fellowship are working on their senior theses, but as a junior, or as like a rising junior, I knew this would be sort of more of an independent project that I wanted to build into a senior thesis of some sort, which I'd be beginning next semester. But yeah, initially I wanted to do mostly archival work, actually, like a lot of archival work. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania has archives from the Southeast Asian Resource Action Center, CRAC, which is the only Southeast Asian civil rights organization in the United States. It's a very large nonprofit based in DC. And they actually started off as a resettlement agency. So they, I'm blanking on the term, but they like provided like sponsorship for families who wanted to come over and resettle in the US, who were refugees from Southeast Asia. And so I was interested in seeing how they transformed from a resettlement agency into a civil rights organization, and also how they've been doing like anti-deportation work as well, and informing some of the archival work with like oral history as well, to sort of balance the archive work with the interviews. And then COVID. So HSP has been closed. So that was out of the window. So I was like, okay, I want to do more interviews, and I want to be able to talk to people. I also had a plan to like fly all over the place and talk to different people who were in these organizations in the 80s doing the resettlement work, like Boat People SOS, which is a national Vietnamese organization that has several chapters. A lot of their work before pre-2000 was a lot of sponsorship, again, a lot of like refugee resettlement mutual aid work. So I wanted to talk to all these different people, and then I was like, okay, I'll do it digitally. And then I just, during COVID, overestimated my capacity as a human being. I like took on too many things over the summer and just like could not do the research that I wanted to do. And then also like I've never done formal research before, so I had to like stumble through the IRB process, like familiarize myself with methods. I was like, Dr. Khan, who's my advisor, was sending me all this material. I had like mentors sending me other material that I was like trying to read when I wasn't doing my internship over the summer and like familiarize myself with. I think this project specifically has been a exercise for me to understand the importance of self-care, because I really wanted to do so much with this project, but it ended up getting, like, this was like the #1 priority, but it ended up getting pushed back in trying to continue my commitments to other things and to like further what I like, and to like further my, I don't know, career by like doing internships and things of that sort. And I think, you know, in doing this project, especially during the semester when I was doing the work, I realized that like, if I did not have the energy to do it, it would never happen. And so I think, you know, honestly, self-care wise, I have not been doing that great, because, you know, school, and this week there were helicopters flying over me for hours on end. And I think that's the reality of our world, is like finding that fine balance between preserving your energy and doing work and fulfilling your commitments. And I think too, this project has been an exercise for me to really appreciate and pause and reflect and understand how important community is, and like how important like having coworkers who'll drop off groceries for you is, and just like people who like want to take care of you when they know that like you are so like emotionally distraught that like you like forget to go grocery shopping and just order food out too often, like go to McDonald's way too much. And so I think, yeah, I think in terms of self-care, I am stumbling through that exercise so much. But I think compared to the summer, I have gotten a lot better at it. And I think in putting a lot of things on the back burner this school year, dropping classes, doing less clubs, I am in a much better space. So yeah, thank you for your question, Dr. Khan. And thank you for your mentorship and support.
My pleasure, truly. So I think we have a minute more to, if anyone else has a question or thoughts, anything you would like to share. And Claire, I wonder if in the chat or if you know of opportunities where students might be able to join you or participate or just learn more, if you could put that in the chat too. I mean, if there's information about Vietlead or
yeah, I can. So with Nancy's campaign, actually it's ongoing, because we found out after her arrest that there were 8 other people in North Carolina who were arrested for the same charges. So they sort of called themselves FAMS, like Frightening 9 or something. And they really like are just so like appalled by the fact that he wants to see this through. Like he wants them to face some sort of time or fine for protesting. And so there's a petition to call the county attorney of Henrico County, where Tony Pham lives, to drop the charges. So I can share the link to that. Let me just pull it up really quickly. And if you could sign it, that'd be absolutely beautiful and amazing. She is known to be a progressive prosecutor, has run on progressive platforms. And so the hope is that she will follow through and end up dropping the charges. I think in terms of keeping up with Vietlead, social media is the best way. And also they have a listserv and they do send out newsletters, but they're more infrequent. I would say that Facebook and Instagram are the best ways to connect with them. So on Facebook, I can share their link right now. I think it's just facebook.com/Vietlead, and their Instagram handle is also just Vietlead. But in terms of Nancy, that's what we're working on, and we do have some campaigns that will be launching within a month or two, relating to some of our impacted base. So yeah, I think just follow them on social media. They're also if you are interested in electoral work, they're asking for volunteers to do exit poll surveys on next Tuesday, because we are concerned about voter intimidation. And so we want to have people on the ground to be able to support. So if you are interested, I can also send that information to you. And if you just want to email me to let me know that you would like to receive that information, that'd be great, because I don't have it on hand. But yeah, thank you all for joining.
And Claire's email is available on the ASAM website under people under UAB. So if you need to find it, it is there. So great. Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Please stay tuned for our next speaker, who is coming up on November 6th. And I don't remember who it was. Does anyone remember? I'm so sorry. It's November 6th.
I think it's J1. Oh no, it's
Nilu. Okay. Nilu Paletti will be talking about maternal health care in the Asian and Asian American community. So please stay tuned for that. That flyer will go out in the next few days. And again, please join our listserv on the asam.sas.upenn.edu website. There's a tiny little button at the bottom of the screen that says subscribe, and you'll be put onto our listserv. We have some really wonderful events coming up in November, so stay tuned for that. And I appreciate all of you. have a wonderful, safe, and safe weekend, and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.